Good morning. I'm Meg King, Director of the Wilson Center's Science and Technology Innovation Program. I'll be moderating today's conversation on artificial intelligence in the Indo-Pacific, which we are hosting in partnership with the National Security Commission on AI, and we'll discuss key elements of their final report on the same topic. We are joined by the Commission's Executive Director, Ely Bajraktari. Prior to joining the Commission, he served as Chief of Staff to former National Advisor H.R. McMaster, held a variety of leadership roles for former Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert Work, and served as a special assistant to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He also served in the office of the Undersecretary for Policy as a country director for Afghanistan and later India. Ely is the recipient of the Department of Defense Distinguished Civilian Service Medal, the highest award given to career DoD civilian employees. Also with us today is Abe Denmark, Director of the Wilson Center's Asia Program and an Adjunct Associate Professor at Georgetown University. Previously, Abe served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia, as a Senior Vice President at the National Bureau of Research, and held analytic positions in the U.S. intelligence community. Author of U.S. Strategy in the Asian Century, Empowering Allies and Partners, and has testified multiple times before Congress. He received the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service, the Order of the Resplendent Banner from the Republic of China, Taiwan, and my favorite is an honorary Rear Admiral in the Navy of the Republic of Korea. Welcome to you both. I'll start with a few questions and then turn over to those from our audience. Ely, as the Executive Director of the AI Commission, can you provide context for those who aren't familiar yet with the report you issued?
Thanks, Megan. Thanks to you and Abe for hosting us today, and thanks to the Wilson Center. You guys have been a tremendous partner for the last 2 years. We have hosted Abe early on when we were getting educated on all issues related to China and technology. So, it's my honor really to have our last event actually before we close on October 1st with Wilson Center. So thank you again, Meg. Just for somebody who has not tracked the work of the Commission for the last 2+ years, I'll give a quick background before we jump into the Q&A. But about 3 years ago, United States Congress, I think, understood that given all the events that were going on around the world, especially the investments and the rhetoric coming out of the CCP and Moscow, they thought that our federal government and our national security departments and agencies are not actually keeping up the pace with the investments and the documents and the strategy needed to put AI and all the emerging tech at the center of what we do on a daily basis. So they created the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. The mandate came primarily from the Armed Services Committee on the Hill, so the SASC and HASC. And they picked 15 individuals, technologists, former national security officials, leaders from the academic world, to look at all the options and all the issues related to AI and how can we adopt faster AI for national security purposes. I'd like to emphasize this to the audience that is not familiar with the United States commissions and Congress bodies like commissions, that we were specifically tasked to look at the AI for national security purposes. So our commission was not to look at AI for humanity or AI for the betterment of the economy or society. We're really tasked with what can our federal agencies do more with AI for their mission and how they can execute their mission with the help of AI. And so with that as a background, we launched about 2 years ago. And we had a process by which, we consulted with a range of actors in private sector, academia, and government. And then as you mentioned, on March 1st, we published our final report, which is about 759 pages. And this is how it looks in real world, if you haven't had a chance to look at our website. But it's a document that I believe not only has some wave top high-level recommendations of what can our departments and agencies do with AI, but it goes even deeper to provide recommendations on how you get those implemented. And so currently, as I mentioned, we're working with Congress and the executive branch to get as many of these recommendations going. As I mentioned, we end in about 2 weeks. So this event is bittersweet for me because it's the last public event, but at the same time, I think since March, we have had an outpouring of support in a bipartisan fashion, actually, on the Hill. And we started in the Trump administration, but we're finishing in the Biden administration. In July, we had a public event related to our allies and partners and what we can do more with them. It was a in-person event in DC, and we had 5 administration senior officials delivering remarks, which I think is an indicator of how people inside the administration and on the Hill are taking the issue of AI for national security purposes. I'll just quickly give an executive summary, high-level executive summary of the final report. So when Eric and Bob Work asked me, like, Ilya, tell me out of 759 pages, what is our executive summary? I say there are 4 big topics and 2 underlying themes. The 4 topics is that really the leadership matters, how we're organized and how we push these issues from the top to the bottom really matters in our federal system. So how the White House is organized for this competition, and how the DoD and other federal agencies are organized for this competition, and the level of guidance and attention that is coming from the top down really matters. And I think Abe knows this better than anybody else, having led so like the Asian Pacific office and the China office in DoD. The second issue is people matter, not only about AI, but anytime we talk about how we cultivate domestic pool and how you bring talented immigrants and you create a pathway for them to stay in the United States, and then how you bring all these talented people that exist in the United States, either in private sector and academia, faster into government. Those things matter. And not just about AI, but like if you want to bring technologists faster into government so they can help the government officials address these issues, I think the policies and procedures we have in place are not right. And so we have a set of recommendations how you fix the people problem. The hardware issue really is centered around the semiconductors. When we started this journey about 3 years ago, this was not a topic that was at the forefront of many officials. But as you can see from the daily newspaper now, we're facing shortages everywhere when it comes to the semiconductors. But the issue really gets even more critical when you come to the high-end semiconductors. And so some of our commissioners who were really much more advanced in thinking kept pressuring me for the last 2+ years that we got to talk semiconductors, Billy. This is an issue you cannot talk about AI if you don't address the issue of semiconductors. And so we have a lot of recommendations that I think the Congress and the administration has taken on how do you stay 2 generations ahead of China in terms of semiconductors, high-end production. And the fourth issue is really research. I think we all agree that the #1 reason why United States still is the #1 country in the world for innovation is because we have the research institutions in place, be it at the government level or the academic level or the private sector, that are still investing a lot in basic R&D. But this has not been happening at the pace and scale we wanted, all of us wanted for the last couple of years. So what we have recommended is really how do you address this research space with new money, new organizational structures, and how you bring all these actors together across the country to really gen that innovation culture that we have had since the end of the World War II. So those are the 4 big topics that are, I think, across our 16 chapters. The 2 underlying themes that are really, I think, critical, and one of them is really important for the topic of the day, is partnerships. Partnerships with our critical allies and partners. So we talk about how you build the existing structures we have in place, something that Abe has worked really closely in Asia Pacific, and then we talk about the NATO and the EU dialogues. But technology requires us to look at new allies and partners, new countries that are at the forefront of this technology. So we have argued that we need to have a technology alliance with India in Asia Pacific. We have argued that Israel and the people-to-people and the research environment that Israel cultivates needs to be elevated in different dialogue with the United States. And then EU. And across all of these things, I think the administration is taking action now. And so there is an EU-United States technology and trade dialogue that it's been launched. And I think the first meeting is taking place in Pittsburgh later this month. And so how do you build on existing structures? How you create new alliances and partners when it comes to technology? So those were the two critical things when it came to partnerships. And then the last piece is everything we do, we need to provide an alternative model to the China and the Russia use of technology. And that alternative model really is based on our democratic values and norms. And so anything we do in this country, everything we do with our allies and partners should be based on the rule of law we have as an underpinning of our democratic society. And so we have a set of recommendations of how you build the institutions we have, because a lot of them are not really set up for the age we're entering, where technology is going to be raising a lot of questions about privacy, and civil liberties and all these issues. So we have a set of recommendations to address these issues that I think are critical. So I'll end it there, Meg, and I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for that important overview, and a nice segue over to Abe. Before we get into specifics about partnering in the Indo-Pacific on AI, can you tell us about technology and security collaboration with allies and partners in that region? What have we done historically? Why does it matter to grow those relationships?
Well, thanks, Meg, and thanks, Ely, for participating in this, for joining us. I'd encourage everybody in the audience to take a look at the report. It's a pretty big lift, as you saw. I think it's over 750 pages. I confess I haven't read every single page of the report, but I have read the parts that talk about Indo-Pacific and talk about China. So I encourage people to take a look at it. It's very dense. It's very interesting.
But it's accessible. It is very accessible online.
Yeah.
Don't be dissuaded.
As a non-technology person, I found it very understandable and very easy to, and very helpful for Congress, especially. In terms of security cooperation and technology with our allies in Asia, there's really there's the private sector and the public sector. In terms of private sector, we're engaging with them on pretty much a daily basis, in which American companies, Japanese companies, Indian companies are working together, and they have established pretty well meshed cooperation in the IT sector, and to various degrees in terms of where their strengths and weaknesses are. But it's a very different story when it comes to defense sector. We do have defense sector cooperation with them, with a lot of these countries. Japan has F-35 as one example, but our allies in Japan and Korea and Australia have a great deal of American-made military hardware, a great deal of our software in terms of exercises and cooperation between our militaries. Between our, in the case of Australia, as part of the Five Eyes network, on the intelligence side, allows for a lot of information sharing. But unlike in Europe, where there's NATO, there's the EU, there is no single institution through which the United States can engage our allies and key partners in the Indo-Pacific. It's based on the hub and spoke model that we established at the end of the Second World War in Asia. And that really has been a challenge for the United States to try to encourage multilateral cooperation between our allies and partners, as well as with the United States on these quite sensitive issues, because there isn't that mechanism. And when you start dealing with a hub and spoke bilateral relationship, the politics gets complicated, the policies get complicated, the economics gets complicated, and it makes for a much more difficult and complex discussion. But certainly something that, as the report mentions, certainly something that we need to address and overcome.
Thank you. So China, and this is for both of you, China is not the so subtle elephant in the room here. You've already mentioned them once, Ely. Can you walk us through China's AI capabilities today? And what about Russia? That's the other country mentioned. Publicly, there's not a lot of information about Russia's capabilities. So can you shed some light, both of you, from your perspectives?
Thanks, Meg. So what we did is we did an informal analysis of where are we versus China in terms of the AI capabilities. As one of our commissioners has indicated, AI is not a single thing. AI, we tend to look at the AI stack, which is a combination of hardware, data, algorithms, applications, talent, and the ability to integrate across all these 5 areas. So when we compared or we assessed how we and China compared, we looked at their capabilities across all these 6 components in our capabilities. I think we came to the conclusion that we believe that the United States has advantage in 3 of these 6 areas. So we have an advantage still in AI-related hardware. As I mentioned, the semiconductors, we still, U.S. allies and the United States still build the latest and high-end semiconductors capabilities. But we have advantage over algorithms. I think our companies and our universities are still the #1 leaders when it comes to algorithms. And then the last piece that we have the advantage is the people. We still have, our universities and our companies still attract the world leading top researchers. But China is investing a lot and aggressively in A, bringing the top talent from around the world, and B, building their domestic talent. The areas that I think we thought China has the lead are the areas of integration. I mean, we see that China utilizing these kind of technologies for their domestic surveillance purposes. But overall, I mean, they're investing aggressively, and they have a strategy that they're pushing in addition to their civilian military integration that they have, or the relationship between their government and their private companies. And so we came to conclusion that the net result of these 6 areas is somehow a draw. But the effort and the attention that they're putting in across all these areas means that they might take an overall leadership in AI. I think according to our commissioners, in less than 2 years, if we don't pay attention, if we don't put the right strategy and we don't put the right resources towards this.
If I could,
yeah,
if I could add on to that, my sense is that that China's approach to AI is very different from how the United States has approached it. We have tremendous advantages in the private sector, as Evie mentioned, with our universities, with our corporations. There was a study done in 2020 looking at how the corporate world of different countries has been adopting and integrating AI, and China was actually 11th in the world, behind Japan, the United States, the UK, but also countries like India, Mexico, Australia, Brazil. But where China's strength is its ability to devote significant amounts of investment in its military, in its defense industries, and drive that in a way that's not driven by market forces, but rather by their national interests. It's a party-centric, state-centric approach to investing in AI, both to monitor and control their own population, but also to infuse AI into the PLA. There was a terrific report put out last year by an analyst named Elsa Kania, who went through Chinese language reporting, Chinese language discussions about AI, and how it's been integrated into China's military, the PLA. What they refer to as autonomized or intelligentized military capabilities, and using artificial intelligence and machine learning to enhance capabilities in in each of their services, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the strategic rocket forces, the support forces, and each one is looking at how AI and machine learning can be used to enhance their military capabilities. And I think it's a great report that talks about how the Chinese are talking about it, but of course there's a difference between talking about it, doing it, and then integrating it into actual military operations, concepts of operations, et cetera. And that, to me, beyond the questions of technologies, how it's actually used, integrated, and operationalized is still a huge question for the PLA and for the US.
Thanks. Eli, did you want to address the Russia piece?
Sure. Sorry, I didn't mention it during your first round of questions. Well, for Russia, I believe, I think our report says that the Kremlin has consistently escalated, the options they have on their cyber tools, going back to, attack on Estonia in 2007 to the attacks on Ukraine's power grid in 2015, to the ransomware attacks that we're seeing globally from Ukraine to, everywhere else. And obviously the interference in the US election in 2016 and 2020. Honestly, these are not AI-driven actions per se, but the technical skill set and the foundations are there in Russia, especially among educated computer scientists, and especially with their intelligence services. The one open source, I think, example of Russia using autonomous system was in Syria. I think they used Euro 9. I think we believe we used that in our report. I don't think that system succeeded, but again, it tells that some countries like Russia and China are much more willing to use the systems without testing and evaluation and so like following any norms or laws for the sake of in terms of military operations.
It's interesting you mentioned the cyber angle because there has been some reporting in the press recently about the Microsoft Exchange hack in the US being the motivation by China that they were trying to collect data for AI systems. And so there's an interesting, I don't know if either of you want to comment on that, but I found that very interesting new angle, very complex conversation. Abe,
I'll just add, Meg. Look, both countries and Abe knows as well. Both countries have capabilities they're investing. I don't think there are any strings attached there between like the private sector and government in terms of like who's gonna use these attacks for government purposes or some ransomware purposes. I think they both are investing heavily in these capabilities. So I think these attacks will continue in numbers and sophistication. And I think the Microsoft attack really, from what I know, was something that was really very sophisticated. That even it caught Microsoft engineers by surprise, what I've read. But again, AI-enabled cyber operations will be, one of our commissioners said, like they will be so much sophisticated that they're going to be micro-targeting individuals, but at micro scale, which I think is something that the cyber operations were not able to do so far. So I think AI will give cyber operations, cyber attack, a new dimension that we will have to live and analyze and probably come up with counter options for the rest of this decade at least.
Absolutely. Thank you. Abe, you alluded to this, that there's a long history of creating standards across allied militaries. We needed ammunition and aircraft to be uniform so personnel could train and operate together on the same equipment. As the commission report points out, AI should be no different. Can you both talk about why and how AI systems need to be interoperable? This can get so abstract so quickly, so maybe a couple of examples would be helpful.
Start, Dave, and then if you can chime in. But look, Meg, I think there's one misunderstanding that every time you talk about AI and military, everybody jumps right away to some kind of a doomsday scenarios, either Terminator scenarios or Skynet scenarios. But AI, if you look at our report, we have 4 areas that AI can enable our military to do their work better. One is it will help our Department of Defense, for example, prepare itself better. And what we mean by this is, as Abe knows, there are so many mundane administrative and bureaucratic processes inside the building that AI can really help fix those. Whether we're talking about travel documents, or travel authorization, known as DTS, that Abe knows extremely well, to other elements of the admin and logistics aspect of DoD, I think AI can help them. The second piece is sensing and understanding. With the number of data that exists out there, AI can enable not just our military, but our allies' military to really be ahead or left of the launch by just seeing the patterns, by just observing situations. I was talking to one of the colonels in the Pentagon about 6 months ago, and he said he has spent the last 16 years in the Middle East operations. And he said about 3 years ago, he noticed that something was wrong with his job. And I said, what? He said, Illy, my job was to look at houses and observe patterns of these houses, people going in and people going out. He said, while that made sense maybe in 2001 and 2002 and 2003, it didn't make any more sense in 2018. He said, I didn't have to be deployed to Syria to look at houses and people leaving and coming into that house. There are now sensors and satellites that can do these things much, much better. And I think with AI as an underpinning technology, it can help our warfighters and our allies and partners, do a lot of these things in sense and preparedness much, much better. The third thing that I think it helped our and our allies' militaries is really in decision making. AI can give warfighters options much faster with a lot of analysis and data behind it. And then it will be up to the commanders and generals in the field to make the call. But as we have argued in our report, the humans will ultimately make the decision. It will not be the machine. The machine will enable the warfighters and it will give him more options, but ultimately it will be up to humans to make that decision. And then the last piece is that I think people jump right away is the execution of these military operations, whether or not it's faster deploying troops to these theaters because AI can provide some kind of a faster logistics piece and a faster like deployment options. But I think on all these categories, from prepare to sense and understand to decision making and finally execution, I think we need our allies and partners to be much more interoperable because the more we're integrated, I think we faster operate, we faster deploy, and we faster execute these missions. So again, just to push back on the notion that people jump right away into the autonomous weapon systems, I think there are so many other elements that AI can help our military and our allies' military that I think would be beneficial, not just from the streamlining of the process, but also from a financial perspective, and also as you asked the question on interoperability issues.
Yeah, to jump onto that, the way I've been thinking about it is sort of a low bar, medium bar, high bar of interoperability and working with our allies and partners. That to me, the low bar which isn't easy, but it's relatively easy, is working with our like-minded allies and partners to establish standards and principles that are consistent with our democratic values that we should be able to do relatively easily with our allies and partners in Asia. The medium bar, I think, is where we are, where I think is also relatively establishable, which is to me the difference between interoperability and compatibility, where we facilitate collaboration between companies, defense industries, governments for joint investment, joint research, and then the establishment of mechanisms to exchange shared data, develop systems that can work with one another, but still recognizes that there's still some issues in place between our countries. Like, for example, there's still significant disagreements between the United States and India on issues like digital trade and investment, where we can't have a free trade agreement with India. The negotiations of which have been stalled for years, which I think points to some of the political and policy barriers that we have with India that would need to be addressed if we're going to be able to collaborate with them closely on things like AI. A different issue being with Japan, which has tremendous expertise on AI, developed through their Society 5.0 initiative and their embrace of technology and robotics to address their domestic issues. While the mechanisms are in place to work with them on AI and technology interoperability, it raises questions for them about the pacifist constitution, about the role that they play in the region, and the role that any sort of interoperable system could play in terms of United States military operations in the Indo-Pacific. So these are all issues that could be addressed, but I think it shows that there's a bit of a menu. Some of the fruit is a bit lower hanging than others, but could still bring some benefits to us.
Are there a couple of specifics that we should try to tackle now, or some in our audience are on Capitol Hill? They're thinking about big moving bills like the National Defense Authorization Act. Is there anything that you can think of that would be kind of more of that low-hanging fruit, specifically in this region? Either of you.
Maybe you want to go. Look, we have our final report has recommendations both for Congress and the executive branch. I think the one we have for this specific reason, for this specific region, already being implemented. We have argued that you need to have emerging tech dialogues among the Quad countries, and I think that has been a topic from day one. since the first president called with the Quad leaders, and then the working group established by the Quad leaders. I think emerging tech is there. AI is at the forefront of them. The other piece, when you ask me about Congress, I think some of the things that we can fix more, maybe probably is the recommendations we have regarding the fixing or creating a pathway for immigrants that come to the United States and they graduate from highly skilled computer science background, and then we want to keep these highly talented individuals and they want to contribute to our national. I think this creates like the people-to-people relationship with certain countries in Asia and Pacific. So I think one of our recommendations is really to create a pathway for these highly skilled immigrants to stay in this country. And I know Meg, I'm big in terms of like pushing the talent piece, because I think the one thing, as I said earlier, we stay ahead is really by creating opportunities for people so we can create home skill talent to maintain the flow of immigrants to this country. The third one is to bring these talented folks faster into the government and keep them faster into the government. So I think we have a lot of recommendations there of how you can create this talent pool domestically. And I think a big part of this is by bringing talented individuals from the Asian Pacific region.
If I could, just adding on to that, completely agree about talent. I think that's probably one of the most important things we could do. And I think part of that speaks to the broader theme that we've heard time and again from the Biden administration on a lot of different issues, has been to organize ourselves for competition and to invest in ourselves, ensure that we're doing the right steps for ourselves. In addition to a lot of what's in the report already about establishing dialogues and mechanisms, organizing ourselves for technology in terms of establishing internal leaders and internal organizations that focus on and drive investment on AI. But in terms of on the military component, in the Indo-Pacific, I think there's a lot of room to discuss, depending on the ally, to discuss how AI can support unmanned and autonomous and distributed operations in a wide variety of different areas, especially ISR, island defense, logistics, all of which I think is what our allies and partners are very much interested in, and which I think AI-supported autonomous and unmanned systems could really help in terms of making our posture more effective, but also more sustainable, both from a political and a fiscal sense.
So there's actually a reference in your report, Ely, about these, I think they're technical data teams, the teams of 3 to 6, kind of in the special forces realm. And when I was reading about those, could you just tell us a bit more about them? When I was reading about them, they go in and they are creating systems based on operational needs in real time. And when I saw that, I was thinking, okay, I could easily see that those teams are members of our military and other military. So could you just talk a bit about that reference, because I think it's a helpful.
So Meg, that's a really good question. I mean, the one good thing about that recommendation is that the Department of Defense has already moving on that one. They have created these data teams that are co-joined by the Chief Data Officer, who is a tremendous guy by the name of Dave Spurk, who has done a lot of good work in terms of like really streamlining the data labeling inside the department. And so this is a joint effort between the CDO's office and Jake for the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. And I think the purpose, as we recommended, was each of the COCOMs have a data needs that can be fixed by deploying these small teams of data scientists or computer engineers that can help the commander at the regional combatant command really address their needs when it comes to the threats they see, indications and warning, logistics and operation. And I think the first teams will be deployed this year. I believe that's what the Deputy Secretary of Defense's memo calls for this to be happening. But this is one of these things in which, when it comes down to DoD, we have recommendations that talk about how we need to be organized inside the Department of Defense. So we have AI at emerging tech at the forefront. And so we start with establishing the steering committee that should be chaired between the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the principal deputy of the national intelligence. We believe a closer link between the IC and DoD is really required when it comes down to understanding the threat coming from our adversary related to the emerging threat, but also, when you have the two most powerful positions in the building, the number two is the deputy and the vice, this ensures that the next gen capabilities are being invested in, are being put at the forefront of each of the services and each of the USD components. So you need this to start at the top. And then we have, a set of recommendations that have to do with money and resources and how you streamline other elements within DoD. So we called on USD R&E, for example, to serve the chief technology officer of the building. After the split of AT&L, the R&E should have assumed responsibility of serving as the chief technology officer. But the split and still is happening did not really empower R&E to serve as the chief technology officer of the building. So we have a set of recommendations to empower R&E, to give them authority, to give them role and responsibilities inside the OSD, but as well as in coordination with the joint staff through the Joint Requirements Office, which is known as the JROC inside the building, where they and the Joint Chiefs can better coordinate the needs of the technologies and the warfighters. And then lastly, what we have is, we made this big bumper sticker called throughout our report that the DoD needs to be AI ready by 2025. I think all of us have been in this space for a long time to understand that this issue of people and this issue of organizational structures have been discussed and tried to be implemented for the last several years. We're still lacking behind in opening the opportunities for technologies to come faster into government, as well as military people to go and serve in private sector companies to gain experience and knowledge and contacts and then bring those back to their services. So we said, for private sector commissioners, having a set deadline with a clear milestone was something that they needed to have in the report. So they said, we need these capabilities to be ready by 2025. Otherwise, we will lag behind in execution and utilizing the AI capabilities for the purposes of our defense. And so I think we have a lot of recommendations for DoD. I think Hill is paying a lot of attention to those related to DoD because, as I said, our mandate came from HASC and SASC. So in the next NDAA, I expect to see a lot of these recommendations really put in the law. And the rest, actually, the department is already moving out. And one of the examples is the one that you mentioned, Meg, the data teams deployed to the regional COCOMs.
Fantastic. We have a number of questions that have come in from our audience. One of them, I believe, is from Jack Shanahan. As you both know, nations across the Indo-Pacific are at very different stages in the development and fielding of AI-enabled capabilities. For this reason, typical alliances and partnerships might not be as effective when trying to accelerate AI integration. Do you have any thoughts on what countries the U.S. should focus on right now? Singapore, Australia, Japan, Korea, et cetera, just for this purpose, or do you think it's better to stay with existing institutions and introduce AI within forums already associated with those institutions?
So I can start. First of all, I want to thank General Shanahan because for this the last 2 years would have been really impossible if we didn't have General Shanahan help us and advise us throughout the way of what can we do better with AI inside the department and his service in establishing Jake and Maven, or still to this day one of the best examples of the DoD's AI projects. What we argue in our report is twofold. One is build an existing institution. And I think we can look at this as from a civilian perspective and a military perspective, like what are the civilian institutions we have in place and military institutions. In Europe, we have NATO. In Asian Pacific, we have the civilian, gathering of Quad leaders. And so building on the existing institutions. And then the second piece is we have argued that you need a new type of coalition you got to build around technology. So in our report, chapter 15, we argue that you need to establish an emerging tech coalition. And whether or not this is a gathering of 12 countries or 15 countries, I know everybody has their opinions of which country should be there, but I think this should be a new coalition of countries that General Shanahan mentioned, who are at the forefront of this of this AI development. They have capabilities. They have a lot of things that can share. We can learn so much from them, but we can also share more with them and also bring new countries to this place. Scandinavian countries are some that come to my mind. Israel is also there. And I mentioned India many, many times in this conversation as countries that can become part of this emerging tech coalition. Not only we recommended establishing this coalition, I think we have flashed out also in our appendices the objective of this coalition. And I think there are like 7 areas that this coalition should sit down and talk, from how we set up standards to how we do data sharing to how do we invest together in R&D and how we do people exchanges. But I think we just didn't want to provide a high level recommendation. We even went a step down and we provide us like the objectives of this coalition and how you can create that one.
Yeah, I have very little to add on to what Eli said, other than 2 points. First, Jack Shanahan's a great American. I'm glad that he's watching. Congratulations on your retirement. I think it's been about a year. And thanks for reaching out. On this, I think Japan, Australia, Korea, Singapore, India are the ones that come out initially in terms of who to engage and integrate on this. The challenge, of course, as you all know, is that the more people who are cooking, the more difficult and complex it is in terms of overcoming institutional, policy, political barriers. So I think we need to be careful about about how broad of a coalition to build, at least at first, and then potentially create a core group and then expand from there. The other question that I would have on this is if and how to involve Taiwan, which also has critical defense related sectors, critical AI related sectors like superconductor industry, clearly has a great interest in the ability of the United States and its allies to maintain military advantages in the Indo-Pacific. But of course, engaging with Taiwan brings its own political strategic complexities. So I'd for one would be advocating in favor of involving Taiwan as best we can. But I also recognize that that there's a lot of questions and uncertainties involved. I'm not sure, Eli, if you wanted to jump on that as well, or if we just kind of leave it as an open question for now.
No, it's fine, Abe. I mean, look, Taiwan plays a critical role when it comes to AI. I mean, I think we've talked today often about the issue of semiconductors. TSMC, a semiconductors company out of Taiwan, is the leading global company in producing the high-end chips, something that I think we need, which is obvious when you read the newspapers daily, because we have a relationship with Taiwan. I think that enables us to stay at the forefront of the semiconductor space. So I think that Taiwan importance is even more prevalent in this conversation because of this dynamic regarding semiconductors. So I think, without going into the military aspect of this, I think anything we can do more to strengthen and deepen our relationship with Taiwan from a technology perspective matters because of the semiconductors conversation.
Okay, we've got 2 similar questions from our audience. One from Ted Ling: should we be using diplomacy to pursue international agreements limiting the application of AI in certain aspects of warfare? And relatedly, from Ginger Jacobs, do you think it's possible to pursue an international treaty on AI similar to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT?
Thanks, Meg. So I think the issue of lethal autonomous weapon systems was really discussed at length among our commissioners. We produced the interim report in November of 2019, and there were 3 issues that our commissioners needed more time and more information to analyze. Those issues were the lethal autonomous weapon system. A lot of our commissioners came from private sector, so they were not so much familiar with the laws conversation, and so like the sensitivities that exist around the laws. So they received multiple briefings. We met with the governmental groups that work this issue, as well as the non-governmental groups that are really passionate about this issue. And so the final report really then has a standalone chapter on the issue of lethal autonomous weapon systems. And I'll just briefly mention, so like 5 points or 5 recommendations we cover in our chapter 4, for those of you that want to get more into details of the autonomous weapon systems and the risk associated with AI-enabled warfare. Those 5 recommendations are: we publicly and explicitly, United States policy should be that only humans can authorize employment of nuclear weapons, and we should seek similar commitments from Russia and China. We argue that we should discuss the AI's impact on crisis stability in the existing Russia, U.S. dialogues on a strategic security dialogue, and we should create an equivalent, meaningful dialogue with China when it comes to the AI's impact on crisis stability. We should work with our allies and partners to develop international standards of practice for the development, testing, and the use of AI-enabled and autonomous weapon systems. And the last 2 points are: we got to pursue technical means to verify compliance with future arms control agreements pertaining to AI-enabled weapon system. This is a really difficult issue. And if we don't have technical means to verify the compliance, it will be really difficult to even impose any kind of arms control in this space. And then the last piece that really came from our commissioners who are well-versed into the research of this topic, they said that we need funding to research the technical means that can prevent proliferation of AI-enabled and autonomous weapon systems. And I said this was a really issue that a lot of our commissioners took to close to heart because of the sensitivities and the public perception that exists out there. I think since the release of our report, DoD has issued a memo on behalf of the Deputy Secretary of Defense on the ethics and responsible use of AI. Even Secretary Lloyd Austin at our summit in July spoke publicly about how DoD intends to use these AI-enabled capabilities. So I think so long we have the right policies and procedures in place, I'm not really worried about these things. I'm more worried about the procedures and policies that Russia and China has when it comes to developing, using, and fielding these capabilities. And so I think, as we argued, a dialogue with both countries on how we can mitigate the risk of these capabilities would be helpful. And so I'll leave it there, and maybe if you want to add anything more than.
Yeah, I think that there's absolutely a role for diplomacy in this. But I think the United States should broadly take a 2-track approach. Engaging with China and Russia, as Ili described, to talk about the escalatory challenges, the stability challenges, the role of human beings in decision making. All of those issues I think are critically important and have implications for arms control, et cetera, et cetera. The challenge, of course, at least from a China perspective, is that China has been traditionally unwilling or uninterested in having these sorts of discussions. For example, China tested its first nuclear weapon in 1964, and we still don't have a established consistent dialogue with them on nuclear weapons. And I think it's difficult. It would be very difficult for us to establish a effective and I'd say an effective and important, I guess important is not the right word, but dialogue with the Chinese on AI, in large part because most of the people that we talk with don't know anything about AI. And the people in China who, in the PLA who do know about AI aren't talking to foreigners, let alone Americans, about these issues. So there's a lot of history, a lot of politics, a lot of ideology to overcome, which is why I think there needs to be a second track in terms of establishing standards, establishing principles, like Ili talked about, the role of human decision-making, et cetera, with our like-minded countries, with our like-minded allies and partners, in order to not let the Chinese and Russians get in our way of establishing these structures, that we engage with them, we try to work with them, but at the same time, we need to make sure that these standards and principles are being established with or without them. And I think that would both advance our interests and our values, but at the same time, put pressure on them, on the Chinese and the Russians, to talk with us and engage with us in the sense that the international community may be passing them by.
Carol Ann asks an interesting question related to China. China's begun investing in introducing AI to children in school. Are there similar educational initiatives planned in the US? Is that a way into this problem that you've just identified, Abe, that we can't talk to the right people who know how these capabilities work? Is this a way forward in addition to your track two?
So I think that question is a little bit outside of the mandate I was focused for the last 2 years. When we looked at AI, we looked at do we have the right processes and tools to create a domestic STEM pool talent? And so the one thing I would say is we still have a lot of gap in terms of the number of job openings that exist in the United States every year. I believe when it comes down to a computer science job opening, there are about 300 plus jobs, 300,000 plus jobs in the market every year. And we produce still around 70,000 graduates with a computer science background. And when you look the data even more deeper, the people with AI skills, the number is even worse. So I think from the AI focus on the commission that we have worked for the last 2 years, we have focused more on how can you increase that domestic STEM pool talent. In terms of the use of technologies, I think, as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, I don't think that some of the strings and impediments we have in our rightfully so in our system when it comes to privacy and civil liberties, I don't think China has those issues. So I think the political system that they have, the relationship between the private sector and the government, gives them some flexibility to move faster in some domains. But also, I mean, what we've seen is they can use AI for domestic law enforcement purposes. They used it against the Uyghurs, and so I think the biggest issue that our commission came with is that so long we stay true to our democratic values and norms, I think that is the message you can send around the world. That's how we can build allies and partners, by providing an alternative model to what we've seen in China right now. And so that is the remit of our mandate that has been for the last 2 years, Meg. It wasn't like, how can we push AI faster to the educational systems and schools. It was like how you create talented individuals that have the right skills in the United States, for this kind of a future.
Can you elaborate on that? And just sorry, Abe, because I think this is so important, and I've recommended this chapter to so many people to read. Can you just talk a little bit about the process that you recommended just for the U.S. government, for getting our own government technically more competent? You just walk through that, and then I'm sorry, Abe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's some really big, bold ideas we have in our final report. One is, how do you create a talent for federal government? One idea was to create a United States Digital Academy. This academy will be similar to the military service academies we have. You would enroll out of high school, and then you would graduate from the United States Digital Academy. The government will place you in one of the federal agencies that you will work on, tech-related jobs. You would owe federal government 5 years of your service, similar to what the military service academies have. And so this is one of the bold ideas, because no matter how you look at the numbers, we still don't have enough people graduating with these kind of skills. And then it comes even worse when, the bureaucratic process we have in government for these kind of people to join government. So one idea is creating a digital service academy. The second idea that I think would really resonate a lot with Abe here is creating a United States Digital Reserve Corps. We have the Army Reserve Corps. Each of the services have the Reserve Corps. We can have people, we have talked to a lot of individuals in Silicon Valley who want to help the federal government, but they don't want to leave their daily jobs. So what kind of mechanisms we can create for those people to help the government in a reserve, core fashion, in which they will dedicate less than 40 days a week, 40 days a year, and they can be placed to one of the federal agencies. They don't have to be necessarily placed to DoD or DIC. All of the federal agencies have some kind of a data or tech-related issue, whether it's HHS or FEMA. So these individuals would not leave their permanent jobs in Silicon Valley, but they would become the Digital Core Reserve members, and they would help the federal government in whatever challenge they have. And then the last piece is really there are a lot of talented individuals within United States government. It's just that the career path inside doesn't exist for a technologist. So if you're a code breaker or technologist in each of the services, there's not a career path within your service to get to the higher echelons unless your career shifts every 2 to 3 years as each of the military services do. And so creating a career path for technologists with each of the services would also help manage the talent we have inside the government. So 3 big, bold ideas: bringing technologists faster into the government, creating new talent by the Digital Academy, and lastly, managing the talent that exists inside the government.
So let me talk about the China piece and then build off of what Ely was saying. In terms of engaging with China, clearly they have a different system with ours. The government can pull whatever technology out of the corporate world that they want, and there's nothing the corporate world can do about it. But there's political and cultural impediments to engaging with them on military level, be it nuclear or AI, whatever, let alone, not only do the people who are allowed to engage with Americans not know that much about AI or nuclear weapons, but engaging with Americans, engaging with foreigners is actually a career detriment to military officers in the PLA, that they get to be seen inside their own bureaucracy as unreliable or untrustworthy because they've interacted with so many foreigners. So there's actually internal impediments against dialogue, let alone, and it often happens, if it were to happen, it would be a top-down directive from Xi Jinping, telling the military, telling the PLA, thou shalt do this, at which point they would do it reluctantly, but they would do it. In terms of enhancing our own AI understanding and capabilities, it reminds me of the GI Bill and President Eisenhower, seeing that we needed an educated and technologically savvy population in order to compete with the Soviet Union. And so the GI Bill was not just a reward to service members from World War II, but was also a way to get the American public educated to the point where we could compete with the Soviets. And I see a similar thread in a lot of Ely's recommendations, be it for the Digital Academy, Digital Reserve Corps. The challenge is, of course, going to be, I see there's going to be a recruitment challenge of convincing kids out of high school, you don't want to work for Google, you want to go into the Digital Academy and make a lot less money for the next 5 years, is going to be a challenge. Obviously, there's ways to address that through pledges to service, the way we are able to recruit now, but that's a challenge, especially for a small populace. If we have 70,000 people competing for 300,000 jobs, that speaks to some of the challenges. The other piece is cultural inside the United States. We saw a version of an internal rebellion inside Google that got them to not renew their contract to DoD on Project Maven, which I suspect just made Ely twitch a little bit just saying the words Project Maven. But I think we see some challenges there as well. So I think the more we can get the American population educated on STEM, on computer technology, on computer information, on AI, the broader population we have, we bring in more immigration to supplement the kind of talent that we're able to build in the United States. And I think that's when we start to be able to really build that internal capability, the internal population of expertise that Ely is talking about that can populate what I think are tremendous ideas for Digital Academy, the Digital Reserve Corps. I think it's going to take some significant investments and significant cultural efforts, the way we saw at the beginning of the Cold War with the Eisenhower administration.
Well, fantastic. Thank you both for joining us today. Best of luck, Ely, with the close down of the commission, although I anticipate you will have many, many, many years of work ahead. And thanks, Abe, for your fantastic context and insight. Thank you to our audience, and thank you for asking such good questions. We look forward to seeing you again soon, and have a wonderful day.